Hello and welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Blackmailers Don't Shoot by Raymond Chandler. Chapter 1. The man in the powder blue suit, which wasn't powder blue under the lights of the club Boulevar, was tall, with wide-set gray eyes, a thin nose, a jaw of stone. He had a rather sensitive mouth. His hair was crisp and black, ever so faintly touched with gray, as by an almost diffident hand. His clothes fitted him as though they had a soul of their own, not just a doubtful past. His name happened to be Mallory. He held a cigarette between the strong, precise fingers of one hand. He put the other hand flat on the white tablecloth and said, "The letters will cost you 10 grand, Miss Farr. That's not too much." He looked at the girl opposite him very briefly. Then he looked across empty tables towards the heart-shaped space of floor where the dancers prowled under shifting colored light. They crowded the customers around the dance floor so closely that the perspiring waiters had to balance themselves like tightrope walkers to get between the tables. But near where Mallory sat were only 4 people. A slim, dark woman was drinking a highball across the table from a man whose fat red neck glistened with damp bristles. The woman stared into her glass morosely and fiddled with a big silver flask in her lap. Farther along, 2 bored, frowning men smoked long, thin cigars, without speaking to each other. Mallory said thoughtfully, 10 grand does it nicely, Miss Farr." Rhonda Farr was very beautiful. She was wearing, for this occasion, all black except a collar of white fur, light as thistledown on her evening wrap, except also a white wig which, meant to disguise her, made her look very girlish. Her eyes were cornflower blue, and she had the sort of skin an old rake dreams of. She said nastily, without raising her head, "That's ridiculous." "Why is it ridiculous?" Mallory asked, looking mildly surprised and rather annoyed. Rhonda Farr lifted her face and gave him a look as hard as marble. Then she picked a cigarette out of a silver case that lay open on the table and fitted it into a long, slim holder, also black. She went on, "The love letters of a screen star? Not so much anymore. The public has stopped being a sweet old lady in long lace panties." A light danced contemptuously in her purplish blue eyes. Mallory gave her a hard look. "But you came here to talk about them quick enough," he said, "with a man you never heard of." She waved the cigarette holder and said, "I must have been nuts." Mallory smiled with his eyes without moving his lips. "No, Miss Farr, you had a damn good reason. Want me to tell you what it is?" Rhonda Farr looked at him angrily. Then she looked away, almost appeared to forget him. She held up her hand, the one with the cigarette holder, looked at it, posing. It was a beautiful hand, without a ring. Beautiful hands are as rare as jacaranda trees in bloom, in a city where pretty faces are as common as runs in dollar stockings. She turned her head and glanced at the stiff-eyed woman, beyond her towards the mob around the dance floor. The orchestra went on being saccharine and monotonous. "I loathe these dives," she said thinly. "They look as if they only existed after dark, like ghouls. The people are dissipated without grace, sinful without irony." She lowered her hand to the white cloth. "Oh yes, the letters. What makes them so dangerous, Blackmailer?" Mallory laughed. He had a ringing laugh with a hard quality in it, a grating sound. "You're good," he said. "The letters are not so much, perhaps, just sexy tripe. The memoirs of a schoolgirl who's been seduced and can't stop talking about it. That's lousy," Rhonda Farr said in a voice like iced velvet. "It's the man they're written to that makes them important," Mallory said coldly. "A racketeer, a gambler, a fast money boy. And all that goes with it. A guy you couldn't be seen talking to, and stay in the cream." "I don't talk to him, Blackmailer. I haven't talked to him in years. Landry was a pretty nice boy when I knew him. Most of us have something behind us we'd rather not go into. In my case, It is behind." "Oh, yes? Make mine strawberry," Mallory said with a sudden sneer. "You just got through asking him to help you get your letters back." Her head jerked. Her face seemed to come apart, to become merely a set of features without control. Her eyes looked like the prelude to a scream, but only for a second. Almost instantly she got her self-control back. Her eyes were drained of color, almost as gray as his own. She put the black cigarette holder down with exaggerated care, laced her fingers together. The knuckles looked white. "You know Landry that well," she said bitterly. "Maybe I just get around, find things out. Do we deal, or do we just go on snarling at each other? Where did you get the letters?" Her voice was still rough and bitter. Mallory shrugged. "We don't tell things like that in our business." "I had a reason for asking. Some other people have been trying to sell me these same damned letters. That's why I'm here." It made me curious. "But I guess you're just one of them trying to scare me into action by stepping the price." Mallory said, "No, I'm on my own." She nodded. Her voice was scarcely more than a whisper. "That makes it nice. Perhaps some bright mind thought of having a private edition of my letters made. Or photostats. Well, I'm not paying. It wouldn't get me anywhere. I don't deal, blackmailer. So far as I'm concerned, you can go out some dark night and jump off the dock with your lousy letters." Mallory wrinkled his nose, squinted down it with an air of deep concentration. "Nicely put, Miss Farr. But it doesn't get us anywhere." She said deliberately, "It wasn't meant to. I could put it better. And if I'd thought to bring my little pearl-handled gun, I could say it with slugs and get away with it. But I'm not looking for that kind of publicity." Mallory held up two lean fingers and examined them critically. He looked amused, almost pleased. Rhonda Farr put her slim hand up to her white wig, held it there a moment, and dropped it. A man sitting at a table some way off got up at once and came towards them. He came quickly, walking with a light, lithe step and swinging a soft black hat against his thigh. He was sleek in dinner clothes. While he was coming, Rhonda Farr said, "You didn't expect me to walk in here alone, did you?" "Me, I don't go to nightclubs alone." Mallory grinned. "You shouldn't ought to have to, baby," he said dryly. The man came up to the table. He was small, neatly put together, dark. He had a little black mustache, shiny like satin, and the clear pallor that Latins prize above rubies. With a smooth gesture, a hint of drama, he leaned across the table and took one of Mallory's cigarettes out of the silver case. He lit it with a flourish. Rhonda Farr put her hand to her lips and yawned. She said, "This is Erno, my bodyguard. He takes care of me." "Nice, isn't it?" She stood up slowly. Erno helped her with her wrap. Then he spread his lips in a mirthless smile, looked at Mallory, said, "Hello, baby." He had dark, almost opaque eyes with hot lights in them. Rhonda Farr gathered her wrap about her, nodded slightly, sketched a brief, sarcastic smile with her delicate lips, and turned off along the aisle between the tables. She went with her head up and proud, her face a little tense and wary, like a queen in jeopardy. Not fearless, but disdaining to show fear. It was nicely done. The two bored men gave her an interested eye. The dark woman brooded glumly over the task of mixing herself a highball that would have floored a horse. The man with the fat, sweaty neck seemed to have gone to sleep. Rhonda Farr went up the 5 crimson-carpeted steps to the lobby, past a bowing head waiter. She went through looped-back gold curtains and disappeared. Mallory watched her out of sight, then he looked at Erno. He said, "Well, punk, what's on your mind?" He said it insultingly, with a cold smile. Erno stiffened. His gloved left hand jerked the cigarette that was in it so that some ash fell off. "Kidding yourself, baby?" he inquired swiftly. "About what, punk?" Red spots came into Erno's pale cheeks. His eyes narrowed to black slits. He moved his ungloved right hand a little, curled the fingers so that the small pink nails glittered. He said thinly, "About some letters, baby. Forget it. It's out, baby, out." Mallory looked at him with elaborate, cynical interest, ran his fingers through his crisp black hair. He said slowly, "Perhaps I don't know what you mean, little one." Erno laughed, a metallic sound, a strained, deadly sound. Mallory knew that kind of laugh, the prelude to gun music in some places. He watched Erno's quick little right hand. He spoke raspingly. "On your way, Red Hot. I might take a notion to slap that fuzz off your lip." Erno's face twisted. The red patches showed startlingly in his cheeks. He lifted the hand that held his cigarette, lifted it slowly, and snapped the burning cigarette straight at Mallory's face. Mallory moved his head a little, and the white tube arched over his shoulder. There was no expression on his lean, cold face. Distantly, dimly, as though another voice spoke, he said, "Careful, punk. People get hurt for things like that." Erno laughed the same metallic, strained laugh. "Blackmailers don't shoot, baby," he snarled. "Do they? Beat it, you dirty little wop." The words, the cold, sneering tone stung Erno to fury. His right hand shot up like a striking snake. A gun whisked into it from a shoulder holster. Then he stood motionless, glaring. Mallory bent forward a little, his hands on the edge of the table, his fingers curled below the edge. The corners of his mouth sketched a dim smile. There was a dull screech, not loud, from the dark woman. The color drained from Erno's cheeks, leaving them pallid, sunk in. In a voice that whistled with fury, he said, "Okay, baby, we'll go outside. March you." One of the board men 3 tables away made a sudden movement of no significance. Slight as it was, it caught Erno's eye. His glance flickered. Then the table rose into his stomach, knocked him sprawling. It was a light table, and Mallory was not a lightweight. There was a complicated thudding sound. A few dishes clattered, some silver. Erno was spread on the floor with the table across his thighs. His gun settled a foot from his clawing hand. His face was convulsed. For a poised instant of time, it was as though the scene were imprisoned in glass and would never change. Then the dark woman screeched again, louder. Everything became a swirl of movement. People on all sides came to their feet. 2 waiters put their arms straight up in the air and began to spout violent Neapolitan. A moist, overdriven busboy charged up, more afraid of the head waiter than of sudden death. A plump, reddish man with corn-colored hair hurried down steps, waving a bunch of menus. Erno jerked his legs clear, weaved to his knees, snatched up his gun. He swiveled, spitting curses. Mallory, alone, indifferent in the center of the babel, leaned down and cracked a hard fist against Erno's flimsy jaw. Consciousness evaporated from Erno's eyes. He collapsed like a half-filled sack of sand. Mallory observed him carefully for a couple of seconds. Then he picked his cigarette case up off the floor. There were still 2 cigarettes in it. He put one of them between his lips, put the case away. He took some bills out of his trouser pocket, folded one lengthwise, and poked it at a waiter. He walked away without haste, towards the 5 crimson-carpeted steps in the entrance. The man with the fat neck opened a cautious and fishy eye. The drunken woman staggered to her feet with a cackle of inspiration, picked up a bowl of ice cubes in her thin, jeweled hands and dumped it on Erno's stomach, with fair accuracy. Chapter 2. Mallory came out from under the canopy with his soft hat under his arm. The doorman looked at him inquiringly. He shook his head and walked a little way down the curving sidewalk that bordered the semi-circular private driveway. He stood at the edge of the curbing, in the darkness, thinking hard. After a little while, an Isotta Fraschini went by him slowly. It was an open phaeton, huge even for the calculated swank of Hollywood. It glittered like a Ziegfeld chorus as it passed the entrance lights. Then it was dull gray and silver, A liveried chauffeur sat behind the wheel as stiff as a poker, with a peaked cap cocked rakishly over one eye. Rhonda Farr sat in the back seat, under the half-deck, with the rigid stillness of a wax figure. The car slid soundlessly down the driveway, passed between a couple of squat stone pillars, and was lost among the lights of the boulevard. Mallory put on his hat absently. Something stirred in the darkness behind him, between tall Italian cypresses. He swung around, looked at faint light on a gun barrel. The man who held the gun was very big and broad. He had a shapeless felt hat on the back of his head, and an indistinct overcoat hung away from his stomach. Dim light from a high-up narrow window outlined bushy eyebrows, a hooked nose. There was another man behind him. He said, "This is a gun, buddy. It goes boom boom and guys fall down. Want to try it?" Mallory looked at him emptily and said, "Grow up, Flatty. What's the act?" The big man laughed. His laughter had a dull sound, like the sea breaking on rocks in a fog. He said with heavy sarcasm, "Bright boy has us spotted, Jim. One of us must look like a cop." He eyed Mallory and added, "Saw you pull a rod on a little guy inside. Was that nice?" Mallory tossed his cigarette away, watched it arc through the darkness. He said carefully, "Would $20 make you see it some other way?" "Not tonight, mister. Most any other night, but not tonight." "A C-note?" "Not even that, mister." "That," Mallory said gravely. "Must be damn tough." The big man laughed again, came a little closer. The man behind him lurched out of the shadows and planted a soft, fattish hand on Mallory's shoulder. Mallory slid sideways without moving his feet. The hand fell off. He said, "Keep your paws off me, gumshoe." The other man made a snarling sound. Something swished through the air. Something hit Mallory very hard behind his left ear. He went to his knees. He kneeled swaying for a moment, shaking his head violently. His eyes cleared. He could see the lozenge design in the sidewalk. He got to his feet again rather slowly. He looked at the man who had blackjacked him and cursed him in a thick, dull voice, with a concentration of ferocity that set the man back on his heels with his slack mouth working like melting rubber. The big man said, "Damn your soul, Jim, what in hell'd you do that for?" The man called Jim put his soft fat hand to his mouth and gnawed at it. He shuffled the blackjack into the side pocket of his coat. "Forget it," he said. "Let's take the and get on with it. I need a drink." He plunged down the walk. Mallory turned slowly, followed him with his eyes, rubbing the side of his head. The big man moved his gun in a businesslike way and said, "Walk, buddy. We're taking a little ride in the moonlight." Mallory walked. The big man fell in beside him. The man called Jim fell in on the other side. He hit himself hard in the pit of the stomach, said, "I need a drink, Mac. I've got the jumps." The big man said peacefully, "Who don't, you poor egg?" They came to a touring car that was double parked near the squat pillars at the edge of the boulevard. The man who had hit Mallory got in behind the wheel. The big man prodded Mallory into the back seat and got in beside him. He held his gun across his big thigh, tilted his hat a little further back, and got out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He lit one carefully, with his left hand. The car went out into the sea of lights, rolled east a short way, then turned south down the long slope. The lights of the city were an endless glittering sheet. Neon signs glowed and flashed. The languid ray of a searchlight prodded about among high faint clouds. "It's like this," the big man said, blowing smoke from his wide nostrils. "We got you spotted. You were trying to peddle some phony letters to this Farr twist." Mallory laughed shortly, mirthlessly. He said, "You flatties give me an ache." The big man appeared to think it over, staring in front of him, passing electrolyres through quick waves of light across his broad face. After a while he said, "You're the guy, all right. We got to know these things in our business." Mallory's eyes narrowed in the darkness. His lips smiled. He said, "What business, copper?" The big man opened his mouth wide, shut it with a click. He said, "Maybe you better talk, bright boy. Now would be a hell of a good time. Jim and me ain't tough to get on with, but we got friends who ain't so dainty." Mallory said, "What would I talk about, Lieutenant?" The big man shook with silent laughter, made no answer. The car went past the oil well that stands in the middle of La Cienega Boulevard, then turned off onto a quiet street fringed with palm trees. It stopped halfway down the block, in front of an empty lot. Jim cut the motor and the lights. Then he got a flat bottle out of the door pocket and held it to his mouth, sighed deeply, passed the bottle over his shoulder. The big man took a drink, waved the bottle, said, "We got to wait here for a friend. Let's talk. My name's Macdonald, Detective Bureau. You was trying to shake the Farr girl down. Then her protection stepped in front of her. You bopped him. That was nice routine and we liked it. But we didn't like the other part." Jim reached back for the whiskey bottle, took another drink, sniffed at the neck, said, "We was stashed out for you. But we don't figure your play out in the open like that. It don't listen." Mallory leaned an arm on the side of the car and looked out and up at the calm blue star-spattered sky. He said, "You know too much, copper, and you didn't get your dope from Miss Farr. No screen star would go to the police on a matter of blackmail." Macdonald jerked his big head around. His eyes gleamed faintly in the dark interior of the car. "We didn't say how we got our dope, bright boy. So you wastrine to shake her down, huh?" Mallory said gravely, "Miss Farr is an old friend of mine. Somebody is trying to blackmail her, but not me. I just have a hunch." Macdonald said swiftly, "What the wop pull a gun on you for?" "He didn't like me," Mallory said in a bored voice. "I was mean to him." Macdonald said, "Horse feathers." He rumbled angrily. The man in the front seat said, "Smack him in the kisser, Mac. Make the like it." Mallory stretched his arms downward, twisting his shoulders like a man cramped from sitting. He felt the bulge of his Luger under his left arm. He said slowly, "You said I was trying to peddle some phony letters. What makes you think the letters would be phony?" Macdonald said softly, "Maybe we know where the right ones are." Mallory drawled, "That's what I thought, copper," and laughed. Macdonald moved suddenly, jerked his bald fist up, hit him in the face but not very hard. Mallory laughed again. Then he touched the bruised place behind his ear with careful fingers. "That went home, didn't it?" he said. Macdonald swore dully. "Maybe you're just a bit too damn smart, bright boy. I guess we'll find out after a while." He fell silent. The man in the front seat took off his hat and scratched at a mat of gray hair. Staccato horn blasts came from the boulevard a half-block away. Headlights streamed past the end of the street. After a time, a pair of them swung around in a wide curve, speared white beams along below the palm trees. A dark bulk drifted down the half-block, slid to the curb in front of the touring car. The lights went off, a man got out and walked back. Macdonald said, "Hi, Slippy, how'd it go?" The man was a tall, thin figure with a shadowy face under a pulled-down cap. He lisped a little when he spoke. He said nothing to it. Nobody got mad. "Okay," Macdonald grunted. "Ditch the hot one and drive this heap." Jim got into the back of the touring car and sat on Mallory's left, digging a hard elbow into him. The lanky man slid under the wheel, started the motor, and drove back to La Cienega, then south to Wilshire, then west again. He drove fast and roughly. They went casually through a red light, past a big movie palace with most of its lights out and its glass cashier's cage empty, then through Beverly Hills, over interurban tracks. The exhaust got louder on a hill with high banks paralleling the road. Macdonald spoke suddenly, "Hell, Jim, I forgot to frisk this baby. Hold the gun a minute." He leaned in front of Mallory, close to him, blowing whiskey breath in his face. A big hand went over his pockets, down inside his coat around the hips, up under his left arm. It stopped there a moment, against the Luger in the shoulder holster. It went on to the other side, went away altogether. "Okay, Jim, no gun on Bright Boy." A sharp light of wonder winked into being deep in Mallory's brain. His eyebrows drew together. His mouth felt dry. "Mind if I light up a cigarette?" he asked after a pause. Macdonald said with mock politeness, "Now why would we mind a little thing like that, sweetheart?" Chapter 3. The apartment house stood on a hill above Westward Village, and was new and rather cheap-looking. Macdonald and Mallory and Jim got out in front of it, and the touring car went on around the corner, disappeared. The three men went through a quiet lobby past a switchboard where no one sat at the moment, up to the 7th floor in the automatic elevator. They went along a corridor, stopped before a door. Macdonald took a loose key out of his pocket, unlocked the door. They went in. It was a very new room, very bright, very foul with cigarette smoke. The furniture was upholstered in loud colors. The carpet was a mess of fat green and yellow lozenges. There was a mantel with bottles on it. Two men sat at an octagonal table with tall glasses at their elbows. One had red hair, very dark eyebrows, and a dead white face with deep-set dark eyes. The other one had a ludicrous, big, bulbous nose, no eyebrows at all, hair the color of the inside of a sardine can. This one put some cards down slowly and came across the room with a wide smile. He had a loose, good-natured mouth, an amiable expression. "Have any trouble, Mac?" he said. Macdonald rubbed his chin, shook his head sourly. He looked at the man with the nose as if he hated him. The man with the nose went on smiling. He said, "Frisk him?" Macdonald twisted his mouth to a thick sneer and stalked across the room to the mantel and the bottles. He said in a nasty tone, "Bright Boy don't pack a gun. He works with his head. He's smart." He recrossed the room suddenly and smacked the back of his rough hand across Mallory's mouth. Mallory smiled thinly, did not stir. He stood in front of a big bile-colored Davenport spotted with angry-looking red squares. His hands hung down at his sides, and cigarette smoke drifted up from between his fingers to join the haze that already blanketed the rough, arched ceiling. "Keep your pants on, Mac," the man with the nose said. "You've done your act. You and Jim check out now. Oil the wheels and check out." Macdonald snarled, "Who you givin' orders to, big shot? I'm sticking around till this chiseler gets what's coming to him, Costello." The man called Costello shrugged his shoulders briefly. The red-haired man at the table turned a little in his chair and looked at Mallory with the impersonal air of a collector studying an impaled beetle. Then he took a cigarette out of a neat black case and lit it carefully with a gold lighter. Macdonald went back to the mantel, poured some whiskey out of a square bottle into a glass, and drank it raw. He leaned, scowling, with his back to the mantel. Costello stood in front of Mallory, cracking the joints of long, bony fingers. He said, "Where do you come from?" Mallory looked at him dreamily and put his cigarette in his mouth. "McNeil's Island," he said with vague amusement. "How long since?" 10 days. "What were you in for?" "Forgery." Mallory gave the information in a soft, pleased voice. "Been here before?" Mallory said, "I was born here. Didn't you know?" Costello's voice was gentle, almost soothing. "No, I didn't know that," he said. "What did you come for 10 days ago?" Macdonald heaved across the room again, swinging his thick arms. He slapped Mallory across the mouth a second time, leaning past Costello's shoulder to do it. A red mark showed on Mallory's face. He shook his head back and forth. Dull fire was in his eyes. "Geez, Costello, this crumb ain't from McNeil. He's ribbing you." His voice blared. "Bright Boy's just a cheap chiseler from Brooklyn or KC, one of those hot towns where the cops are all cripples." Costello put a hand up and pushed gently at Macdonald's shoulder. He said, "You're not needed in this, Mac," in a flat, toneless voice. Macdonald balled his fist angrily, then he laughed, lunged forward, and ground his heel on Mallory's foot. Mallory said, "Damn!" and sat down hard on the davenport. The air in the room was drained of oxygen. Windows were in one wall only, and heavy net curtains hung straight and still across them. Mallory got out a handkerchief and wiped his forehead, patted his lips. Costello said, "You and Jim check out, Mac," in the same flat voice. Macdonald lowered his head, stared at him steadily through a fringe of eyebrow. His face was shiny with sweat. He had not taken his shabby, crumpled overcoat off. Costello didn't even turn his head. After a moment, Macdonald barged back to the mantel, elbowed the gray-haired cop out of the way, and grabbed at the square bottle of scotch. "Call the boss, Costello," he blared over his shoulder. "You ain't got the brains for this deal. For sake, do something besides talk." He turned a little towards Jim, thumped him on the back, said sneeringly, "Did you want just one more drink, copper?" "What did you come here for?" Costello asked Mallory again, looking for a connection. Mallory stared up at him lazily. The fire had died out of his eyes. "Funny way you went about it, boy." Mallory shrugged. "I thought if I made a play I might get in touch with the right people." "Maybe you made the wrong kind of play," Costello said quietly. He closed his eyes and rubbed his nose with a thumbnail. "These things are hard to figure sometimes." Macdonald's harsh voice boomed across the close room. "Bright boy don't make mistakes, mister. Not with his brains." Costello opened his eyes and glanced back over his shoulder at the red-haired man. The red-haired man swiveled loosely in his chair. His right hand lay along his leg, slack, half-closed. Costello turned the other way, looked straight at Macdonald. "Move out," he snapped coldly. "Move out now. You're drunk, and I'm not arguing with you." Macdonald ground his shoulders against the mantel and put his hands in the side pockets of his suit coat. His hat hung formless and crumpled on the back of his big, square head. Jim, the gray-haired cop, moved a little away from him, stared at him strainedly, his mouth working. "Call the boss, Costello," Macdonald shouted. "You ain't giving me orders. I don't like you well enough to take 'em." Costello hesitated, then moved across to the telephone. His eyes stared at a spot high up on the wall. He lifted the instrument off the prongs and dialed with his back to Macdonald. Then he leaned against the wall, smiling thinly at Mallory over the cup, waiting. "Hello, yes, Costello. Everything's oak except Mac's loaded. He's pretty hostile. Won't move out, don't know yet. Some out-of-town boy. Okay." Macdonald made a motion, said, "Hold it." Costello smiled and put the phone aside without haste. Macdonald's eyes gleamed at him with a greenish fire. He spit on the carpet in the corner between a chair and the wall. He said, "That's lousy. Lousy. You can't dial Montrose from here." Costello moved his hands vaguely. The red-haired man got to his feet. He moved away from the table and stood laxly, tilting his head back so that the smoke from his cigarette rose clear of his eyes. Macdonald rocked angrily on his heels. His jawbone was a hard white line against his flushed face. His eyes had a deep, hard glitter. "I guess we'll play it this way," he stated. He took his hands out of his pockets in a casual manner, and his blued service revolver moved in a tight, businesslike arc. Costello looked at the red-haired man and said, "Take him, Andy." The red-haired man stiffened, spit his cigarette straight out from between his pale lips, flashed a hand up like lightning. Mallory said, "Not fast enough. Look at this one." He had moved so quickly and so little that he had not seemed to move at all. He leaned forward a little on the davenport. The long black Luger lined itself evenly on the red-haired man's belly. The red-haired man's hand came down slowly from his lapel, empty. The room was very quiet. Costello looked once at Macdonald with infinite disgust. Then he put his hands out in front of him, palms up, and looked down at them with a blank smile. Macdonald spoke slowly, bitterly. "The kidnapping is one too many for me, Costello. I don't want any part of it. I'm taking a powder from this toy mob. I took a chance that Bright Boy might side me." Mallory stood up and moved sideways towards the red-haired man. When he had gone about half the distance, the gray-haired cop, Jim, let out a strangled sort of yell and jumped for Macdonald, clawing at his pocket. Macdonald looked at him with quick surprise. He put his big left hand out and grabbed both lapels of Jim's overcoat tight together, high up. Jim flailed at him with both fists, hit him in the face twice. Macdonald drew his lips back over his teeth. Calling to Mallory, "Watch those birds," he very calmly laid his gun down on the mantel, reached down into the pocket of Jim's coat and took out the woven leather blackjack. He said, "You're a louse, Jim. You always were a louse." He said it rather thoughtfully, without rancor. Then he swung the blackjack and hit the gray-haired man on the side of the head. The gray-haired man sagged slowly to his knees. He clawed freely at the skirts of Macdonald's coat. Macdonald stooped over and hit him again with the blackjack, in the same place, very hard. Jim crumpled down sideways and lay on the floor with his hat off and his mouth open. Macdonald swung the blackjack slowly from side to side. A drop of sweat ran down the side of his nose. Costello said, "Rough boy, ain't you, Mac?" He said it dully, absently, as though he had very little interest in what went on. Mallory went on towards the red-haired man. When he was behind him, he said, "Put the hands way up, wiper." When the red-haired man had done this, Mallory put his free hand over his shoulder, down inside his coat. He jerked a gun loose from a shoulder holster and dropped it on the floor behind him. He felt the other side, padded pockets. He stepped back and circled to Costello. Costello had no gun. Mallory went to the other side of Macdonald, stood where everyone in the room was in front of him. He said, "Who's kidnapped?" Macdonald picked up his gun and glass of whiskey. "The Farr girl," he said. "They got her on her way home, I guess. It was planned when they knew from the WAP bodyguard about the date at the Boulevar. I don't know where they took her." Mallory planted his feet wide apart and wrinkled his nose. He held his Luger easily with a slack wrist. He said, "What does your little act mean?" Macdonald said grimly, "Tell me about yours. I gave you a break." Mallory nodded, said, "Sure, for your own reasons. I was hired to look for some letters that belonged to Rhonda Farr." He looked at Costello. Costello showed no emotion. Macdonald said, "Okay by me. I thought it was some kind of a plant. That's why I took the chance. I want an out from this connection, that's all." He waved his hand around to take in the room and everything in it. Mallory picked up a glass, looked into it to see if it was clean, then poured a little scotch into it and drank it in sips, rolling his tongue around in his mouth. "Let's talk about kidnapping," he said. "Who was Costello phoning to?" "Atkinson, big Hollywood lawyer. Front for the boys. He's the Farr girl's lawyer, too. Nice guy, Atkinson. A louse. He in on the kidnapping?" Macdonald laughed and said, "Sure." Mallory shrugged, said, "It seems like a dumb trick for him." He went past Macdonald along the wall to where Costello stood. He stuck the muzzle of the Luger against Costello's chin, pushed his head back against the rough plaster. "Costello's a nice old boy," he said thoughtfully. "He wouldn't kidnap a girl, would you, Costello? A little quiet extortion, maybe, but nothing rough. That right, Costello?" Costello's eyes went blank. He swallowed. He said between his teeth, "Can it? You're not funny." Mallory said, "It gets funnier as it goes on, but perhaps you don't know it all." He lifted the Luger and drew the muzzle down the side of Costello's big nose, hard. It left a white mark that turned to a red wheal. Costello looked a little worried. Macdonald finished pushing a nearly full bottle of scotch into his overcoat pocket, and said, "Let me work on the—" Mallory shook his head gravely from side to side, looking at Costello. "Too noisy. You know how these places are built. Atkinson is the boy to see. Always see the head man if you can get to him. Jim opened his eyes, flapped his hands on the floor, tried to get up. Macdonald lifted a large foot and planted it carelessly in the gray-haired man's face. Jim lay down again. His face was a muddy gray color. Mallory glanced at the red-haired man and went over to the telephone stand. He lifted the instrument down and dialed a number awkwardly with his left hand. He said, "I'm calling the man who hired me. He has a big, fast car. We'll put these boys in soak for a while." Chapter 4. Landry's big black Cadillac rolled soundlessly up the long grade to Montrose. Lights shone low on the left, in the lap of the valley. The air was cool and clear, and the stars were very bright. Landry looked back from the front seat, draped an arm over the back of the seat, a long black arm that ended in a white glove. He said for the third or fourth time, so it's her own mouthpiece shaking her down, "Well, well, well." He smiled smoothly, deliberately. All his movements were smooth and deliberate. Landry was a tall, pale man with white teeth and jet-black eyes that sparkled under the dome light. Mallory and Macdonald sat in the back seat. Mallory said nothing. He stared out of the car window. Macdonald took a pull at his square bottle of scotch, lost the cork on the floor of the car, and swore as he bent over to grope for it. When he found it, he leaned back and looked morosely at Landry's clear, pale face above the white silk scarf. He said, "You still got that place on Highland Drive?" Landry said, "Yes, copper, I have, and it's not doing so well." Macdonald growled. He said, "That's a damn shame, Mr. Landry." Then he put his head back against the upholstery and closed his eyes. The Cadillac turned off the highway. The driver seemed to know just where he was going. He circled around into a landscaped subdivision of rambling, elaborate homes. Tree frogs sounded in the darkness, and there was a smell of orange blossoms. Macdonald opened his eyes and leaned forward. "The house on the corner," he told the driver. The house stood well back from a wide curve. It had a lot of tiled roof, an entrance like a Norman arch, and wrought iron lanterns lit on either side of the door. By the sidewalk there was a pergola covered with climbing roses. The driver cut his lights and drifted expertly up to the pergola. Mallory yawned and opened the car door. Cars were parked along the street around the corner. The cigarette tips of a couple of lounging chauffeurs spotted the soft bluish dark. "Party," he said. "That makes it nice." He got out, stood a moment looking across the lawn. Then he walked over soft grass to a pathway of dull bricks spaced so that the grass grew between them. He stood between the wrought iron lanterns and rang the bell. A maid in cap and apron opened the door. Mallory said, "Sorry to disturb Mr. Atkinson, but it's important. Macdonald is the name." The maid hesitated, then went back into the house, leaving the front door open a crack. Mallory pushed it open carelessly, looked into a roomy hallway with Indian rugs on the floor and walls. He went in. A few yards down the hallway a doorway gave on a dim room lined with books, smelling of good cigars. Hats and coats were spread around on the chairs. From the back of the house a radio droned dance music. Mallory took his Luger out and leaned against the jamb of the door, inside. A man in evening dress came along the hall. He was a plump man with thick white hair above a shrewd, pink, irritable face. Beautifully tailored shoulders failed to divert attention from rather too much stomach. His heavy eyebrows were drawn together in a frown. He walked fast and looked mad. Mallory stepped out of the doorway and put his gun in Atkinson's stomach. "You're looking for me," he said. Atkinson stopped, heaved a little, made a choked sound in his throat. His eyes were wide and startled. Mallory moved the Luger up, put the cold muzzle into the flesh at Atkinson's throat, just above the V of his wing collar. The lawyer partly lifted one arm, as though to make a sweep of the gun. Then he stood quite still, holding the arm up in the air. Mallory said, "Don't talk, just think. You're sold out. Macdonald has ratted on you. Costello and 2 other boys are taped up at Westwood. We want Rhonda Farr. Atkinson's eyes were dull blue, opaque, without interior light. The mention of Rhonda Farr's name did not seem to make much impression on him. He squirmed against the gun and said, "Why do you come to me?" "We think you know where she is," Mallory said tonelessly. "But we won't talk about it here. Let's go outside." Atkinson jerked, sputtered. No, I have guests," Mallory said coldly. "The guest we want isn't here." He pressed on the gun. A sudden wave of emotion went over Atkinson's face. He took a short step back and snatched at the gun. Mallory's lips tightened. He twisted his wrist in a tight circle, and the gun sight flicked across Atkinson's mouth. Blood came out on his lips. His mouth began to puff. He got very pale. Mallory said, "Keep your head, fat boy, and you may live through the night." Atkinson turned and walked straight out of the open door, swiftly, blindly. Mallory took his arm and jerked him to the left onto the grass. "Make it slow," he said softly. They rounded the pergola. Atkinson put his hands out in front of him and floundered at the car. A long arm came out of the open door and grabbed him. He went in, fell against the seat. Macdonald clapped a hand over his face and forced him back against the upholstery. Mallory got in and slammed the car door. Tires squealed as the car circled rapidly and shot away. The driver drove a block before he switched the lights on again. Then he turned his head a little, said, "Where to, boss?" Mallory said, "Anywhere, back to town, take it easy." The Cadillac turned onto the highway again and began to drop down the long grade. Lights showed in the valley once more, little white lights that moved ever so slowly along the floor of the valley. Headlights. Atkinson heaved up in the seat, got a handkerchief out and dabbed at his mouth. He peered at Macdonald and said in a composed voice, "What's the frame, Mac? Shakedown?" Macdonald laughed gruffly. Then he hiccuped. He was a little drunk. He said thickly, "Hell no, the boys hung a snatch on the Farr girl tonight. Her friends here don't like it. But you wouldn't know anything about it, would you, big shot?" He laughed again, jeeringly. Atkinson said slowly, "It's funny, but I wouldn't." He lifted his white head higher, went on, "Who are these men?" Macdonald didn't answer him. Mallory lit a cigarette, guarding the match flame with cupped hands. He said slowly, "That's not important, is it? Either you know where Rhonda Farr was taken, or you can give us a lead. Think it out, there's lots of time." Landry turned his head and looked back. His face was a pale blur in the dark. "It's not much to ask, Mr. Atkinson," he said gravely. His voice was cool, suave, pleasant. He tapped on the seat back with his gloved fingers. Atkinson stared towards him for a while, then put his head back against the upholstery. "Suppose I don't know anything about it," he said wearily. Macdonald lifted his hand and hit him in the face. The lawyer's head jerked against the cushions. Mallory said in a cold, unpleasant voice, "A little less of your crap, copper." Macdonald swore at him, turned his head away. The car went on. They were down in the valley now. A three-colored airport beacon swung through the sky not far away. There began to be wooded slopes and little beginnings of valley between dark hills. A train roared down from the Newhall tunnel, gathered speed and went by with a long shattering crash. Landry said something to his driver. The Cadillac turned off onto a dirt road. The driver switched the lights off and picked his way by moonlight. The dirt road ended in a spot of dead brown grass with low bushes around it. There were old cans and torn, discolored newspapers faintly visible on the ground. Macdonald got his bottle out, hefted it, and gurgled a drink. Atkinson said thickly, "I'm a bit faint. Give me one." Macdonald turned, held the bottle out, then growled, "Oh, go to hell," and put it away in his coat. Mallory took a flash out of the door pocket, clicked it on, and put the beam on Atkinson's face. He said, "Talk." Atkinson put his hands on his knees and stared straight at the beacon of the flashlight. His eyes were glassy and there was blood on his chin. He spoke, "This is a frame by Costello. I don't know what it's all about, but if it's Costello, A man named Slippy Morgan will be in on it. He has a shack on the mesa by Baldwin Hills. They might have taken Rhonda Farr there." He closed his eyes, and a tear showed in the glare of the flash. Mallory said slowly, "Macdonald should know that." Atkinson kept his eyes shut, said, "I guess so." His voice was dull and without any feeling. Macdonald bawled his first, lurched sideways, and hit him in the face again. The lawyer groaned, sagged to one side. Mallory's hand jerked the flash. His voice shook with fury. He said, "Do that again and I'll put a slug in your guts, copper. So help me, I will." Macdonald rolled away with a foolish laugh. Mallory snapped off the light. He said more quietly, "I think you're telling the truth, Atkinson. We'll case this shack of Slippy Morgan's." The driver swung and backed the car, picked his way back to the highway again. Chapter 5. A white picket fence showed up for a moment before the headlights went off. Behind it on a rise, the gaunt shapes of a couple of derricks groped towards the sky. The darkened car went forward slowly, stopped across the street from a small frame house. There were no houses on that side of the street, nothing between the car and the oil field. The house showed no light. Mallory got to the ground and went across. A gravel driveway led along to a shed without a door. There was a touring car parked under the shed. There was thin, worn grass along the driveway and a dull patch of something that had once been a lawn at the back. There was a wire clothesline and a small stoop with a rusted screen door. The moon showed all this. Beyond the stoop there was a single window with the blind drawn. Two thin cracks of light showed along the edges of the blind. Mallory went back to the car, walking on the dry grass and the dirt road surface without sound. He said, "Let's go, Atkinson." Atkinson got out heavily, stumbled across the street like a man half asleep. Mallory grabbed his arm. The two men went up the wooden steps, crossed the porch quietly. Atkinson fumbled and found the bell. He pressed it. There was a dull buzz inside the house. Mallory flattened himself against the wall, on the side where he would not be blocked by the opening screen door. Then the house door came open without sound, and a figure loomed behind the screen. There was no light behind the figure. The lawyer said mumblingly, "It's Atkinson." The screen hook was undone. The screen door came outward. "What's the big idea?" said a lisping voice that Mallory had heard before. Mallory moved, holding his Luger waist high. The man in the doorway whirled at him. Mallory stepped in on him swiftly, making a clucking sound with tongue and teeth, shaking his head reprovingly. "You wouldn't have a gun, would you, Slippy?" he said, nudging the Luger forward. "Turn slow and easy, Slippy. When you feel something against your spine, go on in, Slippy. We'll be right with you." The lanky man put his hands up and turned. He walked back into the darkness, Mallory's gun in his back. A small living room smelled of dust and casual cooking. A door had light under it. The lanky man put one hand down slowly and opened the door. An unshaded light bulb hung from the middle of the ceiling. A thin woman in a dirty white smock stood under it, limp arms at her sides. Dull, colorless eyes brooded under a mop of rusty hair. Her fingers fluttered and twitched in involuntary contractions of the muscles. She made a thin, plaintive sound, like a starved cat. The lanky man went and stood against the wall on the opposite side of the room, pressing the palms of his hands against wallpaper. There was a fixed, meaningless smile on his face. Landry's voice said from behind, "I'll take care of Atkinson's pals." He came into the room with a big automatic in his gloved hand. "Nice little home," he added pleasantly. There was a metal bed in a corner of the room. Rhonda Farr was lying on it, wrapped to the chin in a brown army blanket. Her white wig was partly off her head and damp golden curls showed. Her face was bluish white, a mask in which the rouge and lip paint glared. She was snoring. Mallory put his hand under the blanket, felt for her pulse. Then he lifted an eyelid and looked closely at the upturned pupil. He said, "Doped." The woman in the smock wetted her lips. "A shot of M," she said in a slack voice. "No harm done, mister." Atkinson sat down on a hard chair that had a dirty towel on the back of it. His dress shirt was dazzling under the unshaded light. The lower part of his face was smeared with dry blood. The lanky man looked at him contemptuously and patted the stained wallpaper with the flat of his hands. Then Macdonald came into the room. His face was flushed and sweaty. He staggered a little and put a hand up along the door frame. "Hi-ho, boys," he said vacantly. "I ought to rate a promotion for this." The lanky man stopped smiling. He ducked sideways very fast, and a gun jumped into his hand. Roar filled the room, a great crashing roar, and again a roar. The lanky man's duck became a slide, and the slide degenerated into a fall. He spread himself out on the bare carpet in a leisurely sort of way. He lay quite still, one half-open eye apparently looking at Macdonald. The thin woman opened her mouth wide, but no sound came out of it. Macdonald put his other hand up to the door frame, leaned forward and began to cough. Bright red blood came out on his chin. His hands came down the door frame slowly. Then his shoulder twitched forward. He rolled like a swimmer in a breaking wave and crashed. He crashed on his face, his hat still on his head, the mouse-colored hair at the nape of his neck showing below it in an untidy curl. Mallory said, "Two down," and looked at Landry with a disgusted expression. Landry looked down at his big automatic and put it away out of sight in the side pocket of his thin dark overcoat. Mallory stooped over Macdonald, put a finger to his temple. There was no heartbeat. He tried the jugular vein with the same result. Macdonald was dead, and he still smelled violently of whiskey. There was a faint trace of smoke under the light bulb, an acrid fume of powder. The thin woman bent forward at the waist and scrambled towards the door. Mallory jerked a hard hand against her chest and threw her back. "You're fine where you are." Atkinson took his hands off his knees and rubbed them together, as if all the feeling had gone out of them. Landry went over to the bed, put his gloved hand down and touched Rhonda Farr's hair. "Hello, baby," he said lightly. "Long time no see." He went out of the room saying, "I'll get the car over on this side of the street." Mallory looked at Atkinson. He said casually, "Who has the letters, Atkinson?" "The letters belonging to Rhonda Farr." Atkinson lifted his blank face slowly, squinted as though the light hurt his eyes. He spoke in a vague, far-off sort of voice. I don't know. Costello, maybe. I never saw them." Mallory let out a short, harsh laugh which made no change in the hard, cold lines of his face. "Wouldn't it be funny as hell if that's true?" He stooped over the bed in the corner and wrapped the brown blanket closely around Rhonda Farr. When he lifted her, she stopped snoring, but she did not wake. Chapter 6. A window or two in the front of the apartment house showed light. Mallory held his wrist up and looked at the curved watch on the inside of it. The faintly glowing hands were at 3:30. He spoke back into the car. "Give me 10 minutes or so. Then come on up. I'll fix the doors." The street entrance to the apartment house was locked. Mallory unlocked it with a loose key, put it on the latch. There was a little light in the lobby, from one bulb and a floor lamp, and from a hooded light above the switchboard. A wizened, white-haired little man was asleep in a chair by the switchboard, with his mouth open and his breath coming in long, wailing snores, like the sounds of an animal in pain. Mallory walked up one flight of carpeted steps. On the second floor, he pushed the button for the automatic elevator. When it came rumbling down from above, he got in and pushed the button marked 7. He yawned. His eyes were dull with fatigue. The elevator lurched to a stop, and Mallory went down the bright, silent corridor. He stopped at a gray olive wood door and put his ear to the panel. Then he fitted the loose key slowly into the lock, turned it slowly, moved the door back an inch or two. He listened again, went in. There was light from a lamp with a red shade that stood beside an easy chair. A man was sprawled in the chair, and the light splashed on his face. He was bound at the wrists and ankles with strips of wide adhesive tape. There was a strip of adhesive across his mouth. Mallory fixed the door latch and shut the door. He went across the room with quick, silent steps. The man in the chair was Costello. His face was a purplish color above the white adhesive that plastered his lips together. His chest moved in jerks and his breath made a snorting noise in his big nose. Mallory yanked the tape off Costello's mouth, put the heel of one hand on the man's chin, forced his mouth wide open. The cadence of the breathing changed a bit. Costello's chest stopped jerking, and the purplish color of his face faded to pallor. He stirred, made a groaning sound. Mallory took an unopened pint bottle of rye off the mantel and tore the metal strip from the cap with his teeth. He pushed Costello's head far back, poured some whiskey into his open mouth, slapped his face hard. Costello choked, swallowed convulsively. Some of the whiskey ran out of his nostrils. He opened his eyes, focused them slowly. He mumbled something confused. Mallory went through velour curtains that hung across a doorway at the inner end of the room into a short hall. The first door led into a bedroom with twin beds. A light burned, and a man was lying bound on each of the beds. Jim, the gray-haired cop, was asleep or still unconscious. The side of his head was stiff with congealed blood. The skin of his face was a dirty gray. The eyes of the red-haired man were wide open, diamond bright, angry. His mouth worked under the tape, trying to chew it. He had rolled over on his side and almost off the bed. Mallory pushed him back towards the middle and said, "It's all in the game." He went back to the living room and switched on more light. Costello had struggled up in the easy chair. Mallory took out a pocket knife and reached behind him, sawed the tape that bound his wrists. Costello jerked his hands apart, grunted, and rubbed the backs of his wrists together where the tape had pulled hairs out. Then he bent over and tore tape off his ankles. He said, "That didn't do me any good. I'm a mouth breather." His voice was loose, flat, and without cadence. He got to his feet and poured 2 inches of rye into a glass, drank it at a gulp, sat down again and leaned his head against the high back of the chair. Life came into his face, glitter came into his washed-out eyes. He said, "What's new?" Mallory spooned at a bowl of water that had been ice, frowned and drank some whiskey straight. He rubbed the left side of his head gently with his fingertips and winced. Then he sat down and lit a cigarette. He said, "Several things. Rhonda Farr is home. Macdonald and Slippy Morgan got gunned, but that's not important. I'm after some letters you were trying to peddle to Rhonda Farr. Dig 'em up." Costello lifted his head and grunted. He said, "I don't have the letters." Mallory said, "Get the letters, Costello, now." He sprinkled cigarette ash carefully in the middle of a green and yellow diamond in the carpet design. Costello made an impatient movement. "I don't have them," he insisted. "I never saw them." Mallory's eyes were slate gray, very cold, and his voice was brittle. He said, "What you heels don't know about your racket is just pitiful. I'm tired, Costello. I don't feel like an argument. You'd look lousy with that big beezer smashed over on one side of your face with a gun barrel." Costello put his bony hand up and rubbed the reddened skin around his mouth where the tape had chafed it. He glanced down the room. There was a slight movement of the velour curtains across the end door as though a breeze had stirred them. But there was no breeze. Mallory was staring down at the carpet. Costello stood up from the chair slowly. He said, "I've got a wall safe. I'll open it up." He went across the room to the wall in which the outside door was, lifted down a picture and worked the dial of a small inset circular safe. He swung the little round door open and thrust his arm into the safe. Mallory said, "Stay just like that, Costello." He stepped lazily across the room and passed his left hand down Costello's arm into the safe. It came out again, holding a small pearl-handled automatic. He made a sibilant sound with his lips and put the little gun into his pocket. "Just can't learn, can you, Costello?" he said in a tired voice. Costello shrugged, went back across the room. Mallory plunged his hands into the safe and tumbled the contents out onto the floor. He dropped on one knee. There were some long white envelopes, a bunch of clippings fastened with a paper clip, a narrow, thick checkbook, a small photograph album, an address book, some loose papers, some yellow bank statements with check inside. Mallory spread one of the long envelopes carelessly, without much interest. The curtains over the end door moved again. Costello stood rigid in front of the mantel. A gun came through the curtains in a small hand that was very steady. A slim body followed the hand, a white face with blazing eyes. Erno. Mallory came to his feet, his hands breast high, empty. "Higher, baby," Erno croaked. "Much higher, baby." Mallory raised his hands a little more. His forehead was wrinkled in a hard frown. Erno came forward into the room. His face glistened. A lock of oily black hair drooped over one eyebrow. His teeth showed in a stiff grin. He said, "I think we'll give it to you right here, two-timer." His voice had a questioning inflection, as if he waited Costello's confirmation. Costello didn't say anything. Mallory moved his head a little. His mouth felt very dry. He watched Erno's eyes, saw them tense. He said rather quickly, "You've been crossed, Mug, but not by me." Erno's grin widened to a snarl, and his head went back. His trigger finger whitened at the first joint. Then there was a noise outside the door, and it came open. Landry came in. He shut the door with a jerk of his shoulder and leaned against it dramatically. Both his hands were in the side pockets of his thin, dark overcoat. His eyes, under the soft black hat, were bright and devilish. He looked pleased. He moved his chin in the white silk evening scarf that was tucked carelessly about his neck. His handsome, pale face was like something carved out of old ivory. Erno moved his gun slightly and waited. Landry said cheerfully, "Bet you $1,000 you hit the floor first." Erno's lips twitched under his shiny little mustache. 2 guns went off at the same time. Landry swayed like a tree hit by a gust of wind. The heavy roar of his .45 sounded again, muffled a little by cloth and the nearness to his body. Mallory went down behind the davenport, rolled and came up with the Luger straight out in front of him. But Erno's face had already gone blank. He went down slowly. His light body seemed to be drawn down by the weight of the gun in his right hand. He bent at the knees as he fell and slid forward on the floor. His back arched once and then went loose. Landry took his left hand out of his coat pocket and spread the fingers away from him as though pushing at something. Slowly and with difficulty he got the big automatic out of the other pocket and raised it inch by inch, turning on the balls of his feet. He swiveled his body towards Costello's rigid figure and squeezed the trigger again. Plaster jumped from the wall at Costello's shoulder. Landry smiled vaguely, said, "Damn," in a soft voice. Then his eyes went up in his head and the gun plunged down from his nerveless fingers, bounded on the carpet. Landry went down joint by joint, smoothly and gracefully, kneeled, swaying a moment before he melted over sideways, spread himself on the floor almost without sound. Mallory looked at Costello and said in a strained, angry voice, "Boy, are you lucky." The buzzer droned insistently. 3 little lights glowed red on the panel of the switchboard. The wizened, white-haired little man shut his mouth with a snap and struggled sleepily upright. Mallory jerked past him with his head turned the other way, shot across the lobby, out of the front door of the apartment house, down the 3 marble-faced steps, across the sidewalk and the street. The driver of Landry's car had already stepped on the starter. Mallory swung in beside him, breathing hard, and slammed the car door. "Get going fast," he rasped. "Stay off the boulevard. Cops here in 5 minutes." The driver looked at him and said, "Where's Landry?" "I heard shootin'." Mallory held the Luger up, said swiftly and coldly, "Move, baby." The gears went in, the Cadillac jumped forward. The driver took a corner recklessly, the tail of his eye on the gun. Mallory said, "Landry, stop, lead, he's cold." He held the Luger up, put the muzzle under the driver's nose. "But not from my gun. Smell that, friend, it hasn't been fired." The driver said, "Geez," in a shattered voice, swung the big car wildly. Missing the curb by inches, it was getting to be daylight. Chapter 7. Rhonda Farr said, "Publicity, darling, just publicity. Any kind is better than none at all. I'm not so sure my contract is going to be renewed, and I'll probably need it." She was sitting in a deep chair, in a large, long room. She looked at Mallory with lazy, indifferent, purplish-blue eyes and moved her hand to a tall, misted glass. She took a drink. The room was enormous. Mandarin rugs in soft colors swathed the floor. There was a lot of teak wood and red lacquer. Gold frames glinted high up on the walls, and the ceiling was remote and vague, like the dusk of a hot day. A huge carved radio gave forth muted and unreal strains. Mallory wrinkled his nose and looked amused in a grim sort of way. He said, "You're a nasty little rat. I don't like you." Rhonda Farr said, "Oh, yes you do, darling. You're crazy about me." She smiled and fitted a cigarette into a jade-green holder that matched her jade-green lounging pajamas. Then she reached out her beautifully shaped hand and pushed the button of a bell that was set into the top of a low nacre and teakwood table at her side. A silent, white-coated Japanese butler drifted into the room and mixed more highballs. "You're a pretty wise lad, aren't you, darling?" Rhonda Farr said when he had gone out again. "And you have some letters in your pocket you think are body and soul to me." "Nothing like it, mister, nothing like it." She took a sip of the fresh highball. "The letters you have are phony. They were written about a month ago. Landry never had them. He gave his letters back a long time ago. What you have are just props." She put a hand to her beautifully waved hair. The experience of the previous night seemed to have left no trace on her. Mallory looked at her carefully. He said, "How do you prove that?" "The notepaper, if I have to prove it. There's a little man down at 4th and Spring who makes a study of that kind of thing." Mallory said, "The writing?" Rhonda Farr smiled dimly. "Writing's easy to fake if you have plenty of time. Or so I'm told. That's my story anyhow." Mallory nodded, sipped at his own highball. He put his hand into his inside breast pocket and took out a flat manila envelope, legal size. He laid it on his knee. "4 men got gunned out last night on account of these phony letters," he said carelessly. Rhonda Farr looked at him mildly. 2 crooks, a double-crossing policeman make 3 of them. I should lose my sleep over that trash. Of course, I'm sorry about Landry." Mallory said politely, "It's nice of you to be sorry about Landry," she said peacefully. "Landry, as I told you once, was a pretty nice boy a few years ago, when he was trying to get into pictures, but he chose another business, and in that business he was bound to stop a bullet sometime." Mallory rubbed his chin. "It's funny he didn't remember he'd given you back your letters. Very funny." "He wouldn't care, darling. He was that kind of actor, and he'd like the show. It gave him a chance for a swell pose. He'd like that terribly." Mallory let his face get hard and disgusted. He said, "The job looked on the level to me. I didn't know much about Landry, but he knew a good friend of mine in Chicago. He figured a way to the boys who were working on you, and I played his hunch. Things happened that made it easier but a lot noisier." Rhonda Farr tapped little bright nails against her little bright teeth. She said, "What are you back where you live, darling? One of those hoods they call private dicks?" Mallory laughed harshly, made a vague movement, and ran his fingers through his crisp dark hair. "Let it go, baby," he said softly. "Let it go." Rhonda Farr looked at him with a surprised glance, then laughed rather shrilly. "It gets mad, doesn't it?" she cooed. She went on in a dry voice. "Atkinson has been bleeding me for years, one way and another. I fixed the letters up and put them where he could get hold of them. They disappeared. A few days afterwards, a man with one of those tough voices called up and began to apply the pressure. I let it ride. I figured I'd hang a pinch on Atkinson somehow, and our two reputations put together would be good for a write-up that wouldn't hurt me too much. But the thing seemed to be spreading out, and I got scared. I thought of asking Landry to help me out. I was sure he would like it." Mallory said roughly, "Simple, straightforward kid, ain't you? Like hell." "You don't know much about this Hollywood racket, do you, darling?" Rhonda Farr said. She put her head on one side and hummed softly. The strains of a dance band floated idly through the quiet air. "That's a gorgeous melody. It's swiped from a Weber sonata. Publicity has to hurt a bit out here. Otherwise nobody believes it." Mallory stood up, lifting the manila envelope off his knee. He dropped it in her lap. $5,000 these are costing you," he said. Rhonda Farr leaned back and crossed her jade-green legs. One little green slipper fell off her bare foot to the rug, and the manila envelope fell down beside it. She didn't stir towards either one. She said, "Why?" "I'm a businessman, baby. I get paid for my work. Landry didn't pay me. $5,000 was the price to him, and now the price to you." She looked at him almost casually out of placid cornflower blue eyes and said, "No deal. Blackmailer. Just like I told you at the Boulevar. You have all my thanks, but I'm spending my money myself." Mallory said curtly, "This might be a damn good way to spend some of it." He leaned over and picked up her highball, drank a little of it. When he put the glass down, he tapped the nails of 2 fingers against the side for a moment. A small, tight smile wrinkled the corners of his mouth. He lit a cigarette and tossed the match into a bowl of hyacinths. He said slowly, "Landry's driver talked, of course. Landry's friends want to see me. They want to know how come Landry got rubbed out in Westwood. The cops will get around to me after a while. Someone is sure to tip them off. I was right beside 4 killings last night, and naturally I'm not going to run out on them. I'll probably have to spill the whole story. The cops will give you plenty of publicity, baby. Landry's friends, I don't know what they'll do. Something that will hurt a lot, I should say." Rhonda Farr jerked to her feet, fumbling with her toe for the green slipper. Her eyes had gone wide and startled. "You'd sell me out?" she breathed. Mallory laughed. His eyes were bright and hard. He stared along the floor at a splash of light from one of the standing lamps. He said in a bored voice, "Why the hell should I protect you? I don't owe you anything, and you're too damn tight with your dough to hire me. I haven't a record, but you know how the law boys love my sort, and Landry's friends will just see a dirty plant that got a good lad killed. Sake, why should I front for a chiseler like you?" He snorted angrily. Red spots showed in his tanned cheeks. Rhonda Farr stood quite still and shook her head slowly from side to side. She said, "No deal, Blackmailer, no deal." Her voice was small and tired, but her chin stuck out hard and brave. Mallory reached out and picked up his hat. "You're a hell of a guy," he said, grinning. "Christ, but you Hollywood frails must be hard to get on with." He leaned forward suddenly, put his left hand behind her head and kissed her on the mouth hard. Then he flipped the tips of his fingers across her cheek. "You're a nice kid in some ways," he said, "and a fair liar. Just fair. You didn't fake any letters, baby. Atkinson wouldn't fall for a trick like that." Rhonda Farr stooped over, snatched the manila envelope off the rug, and tumbled out what was in it. a number of closely written gray pages, decal-edged with thin gold monograms. She stared down at them with quivering nostrils. She said slowly, "I'll send you the money." Mallory put his hand against her chin and pushed her head back. He said rather gently, "I was kidding you, baby. I have that bad habit. But there are two funny things about these letters. They haven't any envelopes, and there's nothing to show who they were written to, nothing at all. The second thing is, Landry had them in his pocket when he was killed." He nodded and turned away. Rhonda Farr said sharply, "Wait!" Her voice was suddenly terrified. Mallory said, "It gets you when it's over. Take a drink." He went a little way down the room, turned his head. He said, "I have to go. Got a date with a big black spot. Send me some flowers, wild blue flowers, like your eyes." He went out under an arch. A door opened and shut heavily. Rhonda Farr sat without moving for a long time. Chapter 8. Cigarette smoke laced the air. A group of people in evening clothes stood sipping cocktails at one side of a curtained opening that led to the gambling rooms. Beyond the curtains, light blazed down on one end of a roulette table. Mallory put his elbows on the bar, and the bartender left two young girls in party gowns and slid a white towel along the polished wood towards him. He said, "What'll it be, Chief?" Mallory said, "A small beer." The bartender gave it to him, smiled, went back to the two girls. Mallory sipped the beer, made a face, and looked into the long mirror that ran all the way behind the bar and slanted forward a little, so that it showed the floor all the way over to the far wall. A door opened in the wall and a man in dinner clothes came through. He had a wrinkled brown face and hair the color of steel wool. He met Mallory's glance in the mirror and came across the room nodding. He said, "I'm Mardon. Nice of you to come." He had a soft, husky voice, the voice of a fat man, but he was not fat. Mallory said, "It's not a social call." Mardon said, "Let's go up to my office." Mallory drank a little more of the beer, made another face, and pushed the glass away from him across the bar top. They went through the door, up a carpeted staircase that met another staircase halfway up. An open door shone light on the landing. They went in where the light was. The room had been a bedroom, and no particular trouble had been taken to make it over into an office. It had gray walls, 2 or 3 prints in narrow frames. There was a big filing cabinet, a good safe, chairs. A parchment-shaded lamp stood on a walnut desk. A very blond young man sat on a corner of the desk, swinging one leg over the other. He was wearing a soft hat with a gay band. Mardon said, "All right, Henry, I'll be busy." The blond young man got off the desk, yawned, put his hand to his mouth with an affected flirt of the wrist. There was a large diamond on one of his fingers. He looked at Mallory, smiled, and went slowly out of the room, closing the door. Mardon sat down in a blue leather swivel chair. He lit a thin cigar and pushed a humidor across the grained top of the desk. Mallory took a chair at the end of the desk, between the door and a pair of open windows. There was another door, but the safe stood in front of it. He lit a cigarette, said, "Landry owed me some money, $5 grand. Anybody here interested in paying it?" Mardon put his brown hands on the arms of his chair and rocked back and forth. "We haven't come to that," he said. Mallory said, "Right, what have we come to?" Mardon narrowed his dull eyes. His voice was flat and without tone. "To how Landry got killed." Mallory put his cigarette in his mouth and clasped his hands together behind his head. He puffed smoke and talked through it at the wall above Mardon's head. "He crossed everybody up, and then he crossed himself. He played too many parts and got his lines mixed. He was gun drunk. When he got a rod in his hand, he had to shoot somebody. Somebody shot back." Mardon went on rocking, said, "Maybe you could make it a little more definite." "Sure. I could tell you a story about a girl who wrote some letters once. She thought she was in love. They were reckless letters, the sort a girl would write who had more guts than was good for her. Time passed, and somehow the letters got on the blackmail market. Some workers started to shake the girl down. Not a high stake, nothing that would have bothered her, but it seems she liked to do things the hard way. Landry thought he would help her out. He had a plan, and the plan needed a man who could wear a tux, keep a spoon out of a coffee cup, and wasn't known in this town. He got me. I run a small agency in Chicago. Mardon swiveled towards the open windows and stared out at the tops of some trees. "Private Dick, huh?" he grunted impassively. "From Chicago." Mallory nodded, looked at him briefly, looked back at the same spot on the wall. "And supposed to be on the level, Mardon. You wouldn't think it from some of the company I've been keeping lately." Mardon made a quick, impatient gesture, said nothing. Mallory went on. "Well, I gave the job a tumble, which was my first and worst mistake. I was making a little headway when the shakedown turned into a kidnapping. Not so good. I got in touch with Landry and he decided to show with me. We found the girl without a lot of trouble. We took her home. We still had to get the letters. While I was trying to pry them loose from the guy I thought had them, one of the bad boys got in the back way and wanted to play with his gun. Landry made a swell entrance, struck a pose, and shot it out with the hood toe-to-toe. He stopped some lead. It was pretty, if you like that sort of thing, but it left me in a spot. So perhaps I'm prejudiced. I had to lamb out and collect my ideas. Mardon's dull brown eyes showed a passing flicker of emotion. "The girl's story might be interesting too," he said coolly. Mallory blew a pale cloud of smoke. "She was doped and doesn't know anything. She wouldn't talk if she did. And I don't know her name." "I do," Mardon said. "Landry's driver also talked to me, so I won't have to bother you about that." Mallory talked on placidly. "That's the tale from the outside, without notes. The notes make it funnier and a hell of a lot dirtier. The girl didn't ask Landry for help, but he knew about the shakedown. He'd once had the letters because they were written to him. His scheme to get on their trail was for me to make a wrong pass at the girl myself, make her think I had the letters, talk her into a meeting at a nightclub where we could be watched by the people who were working on her. She'd come because she had that kind of guts. She'd be watched because there would be an inside maid, chauffeur, or something. The boys would want to know about me. They'd pick me up, and if I didn't get conked out of hand, I might learn who was who in the racket." "Sweet setup, don't you think so?" Mardon said coldly. "A bit loose in places. Go on talking." "When the decoy worked, I knew it was fixed. I stayed with it because for the time being I had to. After a while there was another sour play, unrehearsed this time. A big flatty who was taking graft money from the gang got cold feet and threw the boys for a loss. He didn't mind a little extortion, but a snatch was going off the deep end on a dark night. The break made things easier for me, and it didn't hurt Landry any because the flatty wasn't in on the clever stuff. The hood who got Landry wasn't either, I guess. That one was just sore, thought he was being chiseled out of his cut." Mardon flipped his brown hands up and down on the chair arms, like a purchasing agent getting restless under a sales talk. "Were you supposed to figure things out this way?" he asked with a sneer. "I used my head, Mardon. Not soon enough, but I used it. Maybe I wasn't hired to think, but that wasn't explained to me either. If I got wise, it was Landry's hard luck. He'd have to figure it out to that one. If I didn't, I was the nearest thing to an honest stranger he could afford to have around." Mardon said smoothly, "Landry had plenty of dough. He had some brains. Not a lot, but some. He wouldn't go for a cheap shake like that." Mallory laughed harshly. "It wasn't so cheap to him, Mardon. He wanted the girl. She'd got away from him, out of his class. He couldn't pull himself up, but he could pull her down." The letters were not enough to bring her into line. Add a kidnapping and a fake rescue by an old flame-turned racketeer, and you have a story no rag could be made to soft pedal. If it was spilled, it would blast her right out of her job. You guessed the price for not spilling it, Mardon. Mardon said, "Uh-huh," and kept on looking out of the window. Mallory said, "But all that's on the cuff now. I was hired to get some letters, and I got them, out of Landry's pocket when he was bumped. I'd like to get paid for my time." Mardon turned in his chair and put his hands flat on the top of the desk. "Pass them over," he said. "I'll see what they're worth to me." Mallory's eyes got sharp and bitter. The trouble with you heels is that you can't figure anybody to be on the up and up. The letters are withdrawn from circulation. They passed around too much and they wore out. "It's a sweet thought," Mardon sneered. "For somebody else. Landry was my partner, and I thought a lot of him. So you give the letters away, and I pay you dough for letting Landry get gunned. I ought to write that one in my diary. My hunch is you've been paid plenty already by Miss Rhonda Farr." Mallory said sarcastically, "I figured it would look like that to you. Maybe you'd like the story better this way. The girl got tired of having Landry trail her around. She faked some letters and put them where her smart lawyer could lift them. Passed them along to a man who was running a strong-arm squad the lawyer used in his business sometimes. The girl wrote to Landry for help, and he got me. The girl got to me with a better bid. She hired me to put Landry on the spot. I played along with him until I got him under the gun of a wiper that was pretending to make a pass at me. The wiper let him have it, and I shot the wiper with Landry's gun to make it look good. Then I had a drink and went home to get some sleep." Mardon leaned over and pressed a buzzer on the side of his desk. He said, "I like that one a lot better. I'm wondering if I could make it stick." "You could try," Mallory said lazily. "I don't guess it would be the first lead quarter you've tried to pass." Chapter 9. The room door came open, and the blond boy strolled in. His lips were spread in a pleased grin, and his tongue came out between them. He had an automatic in his hand. Mardon said, "I'm not busy anymore, Henry." The blond boy shut the door. Mallory stood up and backed slowly towards the wall. He said grimly, "Now for the funny stuff, eh?" Mardon put brown fingers up and pinched the fat part of his chin. He said curtly, "There won't be any shooting here. Nice people come to this house. Maybe you didn't spot Landry, but I don't want you around. You're in my way." Mallory kept on backing until he had his shoulders against the wall. The blond boy frowned, took a step towards him. Mallory said, "Stay right where you are, Henry. I need room to think. You might get a slug into me, but you wouldn't stop my gun from talking a little. The noise wouldn't bother me at all." Mardon bent over his desk, looking sideways. The blond boy slowed up. His tongue still peeped out between his lips. Mardon said, "I've got some C notes in the desk here. I'm giving Henry 10 of them. He'll go to your hotel with you. He'll even help you pack. When you get on the train east, he'll pass you the dough. If you come back after that, it will be a new deal from a cold deck." He put his hand down slowly and opened the desk drawer. Mallory kept his eyes on the blond boy. "Henry might make a change in the continuity," he said pleasantly. "Henry looks kind of unstable to me." Mardon stood up, brought his hand from the drawer. He dropped a packet of notes on top of the desk. He said, "I don't think so. Henry usually does what he is told." Mallory grinned tightly. "Perhaps that's what I'm afraid of," he said. His grin got tighter still and crookeder. His teeth glittered between his pale lips. "You said you thought a lot of Landry, Mardon. That's hooey. You don't care a thin dime about Landry, now he's dead. You probably stepped right into his half of the joint, and nobody around to ask questions. It's like that in the rackets. You want me out because you think you can still peddle your dirt in the right place, for more than this small-time joint would net in a year. But you can't peddle it, Mardon. The market's closed. Nobody's going to pay you a plugged nickel either to spill it or not to spill it. Mardon cleared his throat softly. He was standing in the same position, leaning forward a little over the desk, both hands on top of it, and the packet of notes between his hands. He licked his lips, said, "All right, mastermind, why not?" Mallory made a quick but expressive gesture with his right thumb. "I'm the sucker in this deal. You're the smart guy. I told you a straight story the first time, and my hunch says Landry wasn't in that sweet frame alone. You were in it up to your fat neck. But you aced yourself backwards when you let Landry pack those letters around with him. The girl can talk now. Not a whole lot, but enough to get backing from an outfit that isn't going to scrap $1 million reputation because some cheap gambler wants to get smart. If your money says different, you're going to get a jolt that'll have you picking your eye teeth out of your socks. You're going to see the sweetest cover-up even Hollywood ever fixed." He paused, flashed a quick glance at the blonde boy. "Something else, Mardon. When you figure on gunplay, get yourself a Lugan that knows what it's all about. The gay caballero here forgot to thumb back his safety." Mardon stood frozen. The blonde boy's eyes flinched down to his gun for a split second of time. Mallory jumped fast along the wall, and his Luger snapped into his hand. The blonde boy's face tensed, his gun crashed. Then the Luger cracked, and a slug went into the wall beside the blonde boy's gay felt hat. Henry faded down gracefully, squeezed lead again. The shot knocked Mallory back against the wall. His left arm went dead. His lips writhed angrily. He steadied himself. The Luger talked twice, very rapidly. The blonde boy's gun arm jerked up, and the gun sailed against the wall high up. His eyes widened. His mouth came open in a yell of pain. Then he whirled, wrenched the door open, and pitched straight out on the landing with a crash. Light from the room streamed after him. Somebody shouted somewhere. A door banged. Mallory looked at Mardon, saying evenly, "Got me in the arm. I could have killed the bastard 4 times." Mardon's hand came up from the desk with a blued revolver in it. A bullet splashed into the floor at Mallory's feet. Mardon lurched drunkenly, threw the gun away like something red hot. His hands groped high in the air. He looked scared stiff. Mallory said, "Get in front of me, big shot. I'm moving out of here." Mardon came out from behind the desk. He moved jerkily like a marionette. His eyes were as dead as stale oysters. Saliva drooled down his chin. Something loomed in the doorway. Mallory heaved sideways, firing blindly at the door. But the sound of the Luger was overborne by the terrific flat booming of a shotgun. Searing flames stabbed down Mallory's right side. Mardon got the rest of the load. He plunged to the floor on his face, dead before he landed. A sawed-off shotgun dumped itself in through the open door. A thick-bellied man in shirt-sleeves eased himself down in the doorframe, clutching and rolling as he fell. A strangled sob came out of his mouth, and blood spread on the pleated front of a dress shirt. Sudden noise flared out down below. Shouting, running feet, a shrilling off-key laugh. A high sound that might have been a shriek. Cars started outside. Tires screeched on the driveway. The customers were getting away. A pane of glass went out somewhere. There was a loose clatter of running feet on a sidewalk across the lighted patch of landing. Nothing moved. The blonde boy groaned softly, out there on the floor behind the dead man in the doorway. Mallory plowed across the room, sank into the chair at the end of the desk. He wiped sweat from his eyes with the heel of his gun hand. He leaned his ribs against the desk, panting, watching the door. His left arm was throbbing now, and his right leg felt like the plagues of Egypt. Blood ran down his sleeve inside, down on his hand off the tips of 2 fingers. After a while, he looked away from the door. at the packet of notes lying on the desk under the lamp. Reaching across, he pushed them into the open drawer with the muzzle of the Luger. Grinning with pain, he leaned far enough over to pull the drawer shut. Then he opened and closed his eyes quickly, several times, squeezing them tight together, then snapping them open wide. That cleared his head a little. He drew the telephone towards him. There was silence below stairs now. Mallory put the Luger down, lifted the phone off the prongs and put it down beside the Luger. He said out loud, "Too bad, baby. Maybe I played it wrong after all. Maybe the louse hadn't the guts to hurt you at that. Well, there's got to be talking done now." As he began to dial, the wail of a siren got louder. Chapter 10. The uniformed officer behind the typewriter desk talked into a dictaphone, then looked at Mallory and jerked his thumb towards a glass-paneled door that said, "Captain of Detectives. Private." Mallory got up stiffly from a hard chair and went across the room, leaned against the wall to open the glass-paneled door, went on in. The room he went into was paved with dirty brown linoleum, furnished with the peculiar sordid hideousness only municipalities can achieve. Cathcart, the captain of detectives, sat in the middle of it alone, between a littered roll-top desk that was not less than 20 years old and a flat oak table large enough to play ping-pong on. Cathcart was a big, shabby Irishman with a sweaty face and a loose-lipped grin. His white mustache was stained in the middle by nicotine. His hands had a lot of warts on them. Mallory went towards him slowly, leaning on a heavy cane with a rubber tip. His right leg felt large and hot. His left arm was in a sling made from a black silk scarf. He was freshly shaved. His face was pale and his eyes were as dark as slate. He sat down across the table from the captain of detectives, put his cane on the table, tapped a cigarette and lit it. Then he said casually, "What's the verdict, Chief?" Cathcart grinned. "How you feel, kid? You look kind of pulled down." "Not bad. A bit stiff." Cathcart nodded, cleared his throat, fumbled unnecessarily with some papers that were in front of him. He said, "You're clear. It's a Lulu, but you're clear. Chicago gives you a clean sheet, damn clean. Your Luger got Mike Corliss, a 2-time loser. I'm keeping the Luger for a souvenir, okay?" Mallory nodded. "Okay. I'm getting me A25 with copper slugs. A sharpshooter's gun. No shock effect, but it goes better with evening clothes." Cathcart looked at him closely for a minute, then went on, "Mike's prints are on the shotgun. The shotgun got Mardon. Nobody's crying about that much. The blonde kid ain't hurt bad. That automatic we found on the floor had his prints, and that will take care of him for a while." Mallory rubbed his chin wearily. "How about the others?" The captain raised tangled eyebrows, and his eyes looked absent. He said, "I don't know of nothing to connect you there. Do you?" "Not a thing," Mallory said apologetically. "I was just wondering." The captain said firmly, "Don't wonder, and don't get to guessing if anybody should ask you. Take that Baldwin Hills thing. The way we figure it, Macdonald got killed in the line of duty, taking with him a dope peddler named Slippy Morgan. We have a tag out for Slippy's wife, but I don't guess we'll make her. Mac wasn't on the narcotic detail, but it was his night off, and he was a great guy to gumshoe around on his night off. Mac loved his work." Mallory smiled faintly, said politely, "Is that so?" "Yeah," the captain said. "In the other one it seems this Landry, a known gambler. He was Mardon's partner too. That's kind of a funny coincidence. Went down to Westwood to collect dough from a guy called Costello that ran a book on the Eastern Tracks. Jim Ralston, one of our boys, went with him. Hadn't ought to, but he knew Landry pretty well. There was a little trouble about the money. Jim got beaned with a blackjack, and Landry and some little hood fogged each other. There was another guy there we don't trace. We got Costello, but he won't talk, and we don't like to beat up an old guy. He's got a rap coming on account of the blackjack. Or he'll plead, I guess." Mallory slumped down in his chair until the back of his neck rested on top of it. He blew smoke straight up towards the stained ceiling. He said, "How about night before last? Or was that the time the roulette wheel backfired and the trick cigar blew a hole in the garage floor?" The captain of detectives rubbed both his moist cheeks briskly, then hauled out a very large handkerchief and snorted into it. "Oh, that," he said negligently. "That wasn't nothin'. The blonde kid, Henry Anson or something like that, says it was all his fault. He was Mardon's bodyguard, but that didn't mean he could go shootin' anyone he might want to. That takes care of him, but we let him down easy for tellin' a straight story." The captain stopped short and stared at Mallory hard-eyed. Mallory was grinning. "Of course, if you don't like his story," the captain went on coldly. Mallory said, "I haven't heard it yet. I'm sure I'll like it fine." "Okay," Cathcart rumbled, mollified. "Well, this Anson says Mardon buzzed him in where you and the boss were talking. You was making a kick about something, maybe a crooked wheel downstairs. There was some money on the desk, and Anson got the idea it was a shake. You looked pretty fast to him, and not knowing you as a dick, he gets kinda nervous. His gun went off. You didn't shoot right away, but the poor sap lets off another round and plugs you. Then, you drilled him in the shoulder, as who wouldn't? Only if it had been me, I'd have pumped his guts. Then the shotgun boy comes barging in, lets go without asking any questions, fogs Mardon and stops one from you. We kinda thought at first the guy might have got Mardon on purpose, but the kid says no. He tripped in the door coming in. Hell, we don't like for you to do all that shooting, you being a stranger and all that. But a man ought to have a right to protect himself against illegal weapons." Mallory said gently, "There's the DA and the coroner. How about them? I'd kind of like to go back as clean as I came away." Cathcart frowned down at the dirty linoleum and bit his thumb as if he liked hurting himself. "The coroner don't give a damn about that trash. If the DA wants to get funny, I can tell him about a few cases his office didn't clean up so good." Mallory lifted his cane off the table, pushed his chair back, put weight on the cane, and stood up. "You have a swell police department here," he said. "I shouldn't think you'd have any crime at all." He moved across towards the outer door. The captain said to his back, "Going on to Chicago?" Mallory shrugged carefully with his right shoulder, the good one. "I might stick around," he said. "One of the studios made me a proposition. Private extortion detail, blackmail and so on." The captain grinned heartily. "Swell," he said. "Eclipse Films is a swell outfit. They always been swell to me. Nice easy work, blackmail. Oughtn't to run into any rough stuff." Mallory nodded solemnly. "Just light work, Chief. Almost effeminate, if you know what I mean." He went on out, down the hall to the elevator, down to the street. He got into a taxi. It was hot in the taxi. He felt faint and dizzy going back to his hotel. End of Blackmailers Don't Shoot by Raymond Chandler.